Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people out tonight. We're really thrilled to have such a great audience. Thank you so much. My name is Leslie Wingate, and I'm Director of Campus and Community Relations here in Emory Libraries. I'm also an Emory alum. I graduated in 1982 from Emory College. So thank you all for being here, and I'm thrilled to be doing this program. I want to recognize my boss, Yolanda Cooper, who's in the audience. Yolanda, if you don't mind quickly standing. Yolanda is the university librarian here, and I'm very grateful to her because she hired me about 8 months or so ago. And I came over from the Emory Alumni Association, where I was for 12 years, but it's really fun being in the libraries. It's really the hub of the university, and there's just so much going on here, and it's just a great place to be. So I'm very grateful to be here. As you probably know, it takes a village to put on this kind of an event. Lots and lots of people, lots of hands involved. So I thank everyone who was involved, but I do want to especially recognize 2 colleagues of mine who really kind of went above and beyond and had played crucial roles in the development of this program. First, Holly Crenshaw. Holly, if you don't mind just raising your hand, standing. Holly is on my team. She's the marketing and communications director here. She also has a journalism background. She worked as a journalist for the AJC for 25 years or so, right, Holly? She also has a library science degree, so she really was the one who came up with the concept for this program, and I think it's such a great one. So thank you, Holly, for doing that. And then Becky Herring, I don't even think is in here, but she's the one who's behind the scenes doing all the event planning. She's our interim events manager, so if you see her, please say hi and thank you. So when we talked about developing this program, we had a few goals. One was to come up with a timely topic. I think we did that. One was to connect the work of the libraries and Emory with this program. That's where Holly was really helpful with all of her background in both of these areas. So information literacy is at the heart of what we do in Emory Libraries, and it's at the heart of the program this evening as we talk about how information comes in varying degrees of quality. Here at Emory, there's an emphasis on primary evidence, going back to original sources and verifying facts for oneself. This is also at the heart of our program this evening. We wanted to feature faculty. So one of our goals this year in our team is to showcase our wonderful faculty and faculty excellence. So we pulled in Andra Gillespie, who will be introduced more formally later by Crystal Edmonson. So we have our great faculty member who's with the political science here at Emory. And then Crystal, who's our moderator, who I'll introduce in a minute, also served as an adjunct faculty here, right, in the journalism department. So she qualifies as faculty too. And then she's also our alum. So wearing that alumni hat from all my years at the Alumni Association, I wanted an alum representative. So we have our notable alumna, Crystal Edmonson, with us. So I think we've met all of our goals. I hope so anyway. So my main role right now is to introduce Crystal Edmonson, who's our moderator this evening, and then she'll introduce our panelists. Crystal and I have worked together on many things over the years. I've known her for 12 or 13 years, and she's done so much for me. So thank you, Crystal, for everything you do for Emory, which is a lot. Crystal Edmonson keeps her finger on the pulse of business in Atlanta. She's Atlanta Business Chronicle's broadcast editor and host of the paper's weekly television program, Biz, which airs Sundays at 11 a.m. on 11 Alive. In addition to overseeing production of Atlanta Business Chronicle's Biz, she also delivers business reports every day on several local radio stations, such as New Radio 106.7 FM, Atlanta's NPR station. You've probably heard her if you listen to NPR, WABE, Sports Radio 680. When she's not in front of a television camera or behind a radio microphone, she enjoys mentoring college students and young professionals across the country. Since 2005, Crystal has served as a local coordinator for American City Business Journal's summer internship program. A number of students have been hired full-time since the program began. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you to our panelists today. I'm most grateful, and take it away, Crystal.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I'm so excited to be here and to be a part of this program this evening. ever since Leslie brought the idea to me, and I've been sort of preparing, casually and saying, "Gosh, well, what are we going to talk about?" And then, of course, you turn on the television or turn on the radio, and I'm like, "Oh, there's something else. Okay, plenty to talk about." So it's fantastic, and it's so appropriate for it to be here at the libraries, where the focus is on information and primary sources and getting the facts right and having all of the information. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of this program. Without further ado, I'd like to just briefly mention our panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do in their day jobs, so to speak, and what they bring to our discussion this evening. We'll start with Andra Gillespie. She, of course, is the Emory Associate Professor of Political Science, as Leslie mentioned. She's also director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. Next to her, we have Jim Tharpe, who is with the AJC and editor of PolitiFact Georgia. And then also we have Nancy Leung, who is with CNN, and she is the senior editor of CNN's Reality Check. So I'm going to start here with Andra. If you could start us off and tell us a little bit about what you do in your day job, and we'll start with you. Yep.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Good. So I'm not a journalist. I do get called upon to do public scholarship, and most of the time my job is just to interpret what's in front of me. And so I use my background in political science to explain how the theories that I teach in the classroom actually apply to real politics. Part of my public scholarship portfolio has involved live tweeting certain types of events, so conventions, debates. And usually when I'm confronted with false information, sometimes I'll phrase it in the form of a question. So if you go back through my tweets in the last couple of weeks, when Mike Pence was denying certain things that were kind of said on tape, I might send out a tweet in the form of a question going, "But didn't he say such and such?" And then, your followers will write back and kind of confirm that you did hear that correctly and that this might in fact be wrong. There have also been a couple of instances in particular where not being a journalist has actually been really helpful. So for instance, it's a pretty famous story that for formal journalists, when they go to Trump events, for instance, there are rules about where they can sit, where they can stand, and in particular where their cameras are positioned. And so cameras are positioned so that they're in front of the stage and they can only focus on Donald Trump. So you can't go to the side. So if there are any skirmishes or disturbances, it's actually really hard for camera people to be able to capture that information. Well, the other thing that I've learned, having gone to a few Trump events, is that Trump will estimate the size of the crowd and it will look nothing like what I think it is. So it's happened to me a few times where I've been in an event and I think he's, increased the size of the crowd by a substantial proportion. So it's varied depending on sort of where I've been, but being in the crowd kind of allows me to kind of be able to do that. So most of the time what I'm interested in my day job and in my research, I study African American political leadership, and I'm interested in politicians like President Obama, who try to present themselves as being racially transcendent and sort of what the implications are for African American politics. But part of that is, just a general training in American politics. And one of the chapters in my book on now Senator Cory Booker was this title called "Perception is Reality." And so I think one of the interesting things that's coming out of this cycle is how perception is reality. So it's not always facts that are reality. It's not always evidence that is reality. It is the perception of it. And that, I think, really explains why we see people being gravitated towards certain types of candidates and why people stick with candidates even in the face of information that could be perceived to be troubling, disheartening, perhaps disqualifying in some instances. So we have to think about the emotional undercurrents that are explaining, and that can predict vote choice as much as we think about whether or not what they're saying is plausible or even factual.
Very interesting. So a lot to talk about. We'll get into the discussion. But Jim, if you would, take a few minutes to introduce yourself to the crowd here.
I'm Jim Tharpe, editor of PolitiFact Georgia at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And I thought I'd give you a little background about what PolitiFact is and what it does. It was started back in 2007 by a guy named Bill Adair. He was the Washington bureau chief for the St. Pete Times. Bill started this. The next year they covered the 2008 campaign and won a Pulitzer Prize for that coverage. It was about 2 years after that PolitiFact Georgia joined that team along with PolitiFact Texas. We're now in 18 states and we're in some foreign countries. From the outset, our mission has been very simple. It's very direct. We try to parse political fact from political fiction, and we do it through mid-level investigative reporting, and we rate our findings on something we call the truth-o-meter. It's a very cartoonish thing. I'm sure you've seen it. And our main objective is to kind of turn down the volume on American politics. Have you guys seen the movie Spinal Tap? You remember the guy there? He has the volume thing that goes up to 11. Well, American politics these days, the stereo is turned up to 11, 12, 13, and with Trump, maybe 14. Our job is to turn it back down to 4 or 5, get down in the weeds and make sense of things, and try to inform voters. We're not trying to make politicians more honest, forgive me, but that's impossible in some cases, and in some cases not. But that's not our job. Our job is to have a better informed electorate. And you have to remember that 10 years ago, nobody knew what the word PolitiFact was, and now it's kind of a household word, and we have a little video to kind of demonstrate that.
PolitiFact, the nonpartisan fact-checking guy or guys or girls.
PolitiFact, which keeps track of whether politicians keep their promises. This is a promise kept by me.
And by the way, I have mentioned these facts in the past. PolitiFact, who seems to check every statement that I make, checked it out, and what they said is these facts are basically accurate.
Please don't PolitiFact me, whoever is following this.
So I think when they say things that are inaccurate, they're getting called on it more often.
But at PolitiFact, we always say words matter.
A nonpartisan fact-checking service called PolitiFact, and PolitiFact rated Fiorina's statement as mostly false.
So he's ticked off about this ad, which PolitiFact has already rated mostly false.
PolitiFact is out with its Lie of the Year, and the award goes to hyped-up claims about Ebola.
PolitiFact took Nancy Pelosi's lines of what she said. They just said true. It was just out and out false.
PolitiFact says that's not true, but the ad's resonating. What's your reaction?
40% at best, and that's only because I'm going to be PolitiFacted. So.
The ad was so outrageous that PolitiFact, I know they don't think fact checkers matter, but PolitiFact called it wholly inaccurate.
Statements aren't always, rated true by PolitiFact. PolitiFact. Do you not know what PolitiFact is? Give me the truth. Give me the truth. Give me the truth.
That film is a bit of braggadocio by PolitiFact. It was played when we had the PolitiFact gathering for all the national editors here in Atlanta. This past year, I think there were 40 or so people. But it does show how fact-checking has grown and everybody's talking about it. And one of the things I'd like to say, in fairness to politicians, most of our rulings, we're known for our pants on fire ruling. Very few people get that, and they get it very seldom. Most political statements we rate are in the middle of the meter. They're half true. They're partially true, but spun to make a point. And that's kind of where we're at.
I don't know, Jim, I like to see that pants on fire thing. It's like,
everybody
really
does,
lie.
and when people call me up, they say, you're the guy that does the pants on fire meter. And I say, well, we occasionally do that, but a lot of times politicians actually tell the truth. So,
Good point, good point. Thank you, Jim. Nancy, time to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about what you do in your day job and how we can inform our crowd today.
Hi, so my name's Nancy Leung. By day, I am a senior editor on CNN's VRO, which basically means the unit that I work on is the editorial quality control of what CNN reports. And that includes my night job, and also by day, the reality check team. We don't really call it the fact-checking team because we also want to put what the candidates say into context. Similar to what PolitiFact does, we also have a rating system, not nearly as fancy. Ours is true, mostly true, true but misleading, false, or it's complicated. That last that last one we tried to avoid because then it really doesn't do any justice to what's said and it doesn't really help the voters. We have grown during the debates with the Republicans and the Democrats. We've probably had about 24 people on the team with maybe an average of 15 checks a night. In the presidential debates, we've had about the same number of people with closer to 30, sometimes a little bit closer to 40 checks a night. And we have specialists on national security to the medical. We have generalists, people who focus on the State Department. And so it's one giant team. I have to agree with you, well, maybe disagree. We find that a lot of the candidates spin and exaggerate the truth a lot, but we have found quite a number of falsehoods. I'm not going to say from which candidates.
Well, Nancy, I'd like to stick with you for a minute because I think it's really interesting to note how the number of checks has increased. And I'm wondering, why do you think there is such a growing interest or why the demand has picked up in these fact-checking services that you all offer, whether it's PolitiFact or Reality Check, but why do you think the demand is there?
I'm not really sure why, other than I think that this election in particular has been full of statements that makes you think, really? Did that really happen? And as a journalist, we want to hold the candidates accountable, and I think that the voters want to know the truth. Whether or not that actually sinks in is a whole nother question you may have later.
I blame the internet for the whole thing. When I was a kid, I'm old, I'm past 60 now, but when I was a kid, you had a local newspaper, you had a couple of TV stations, excuse me, the family watched the nightly news together. You go on the internet now, I read more than I've ever read in my life, and I'm probably a little more misinformed. There's so much stuff coming at you from so many directions, you don't know what to believe. And so I think that's why fact-checking's growing.
So there's so much information.
A lot of information, and there's no real filter for it anymore. You used to have better filters than you have now. You have better information out there if you know how to filter it, if you have the time to filter it, if you have somebody to filter it. And I think that's what fact checkers are filling in that void to do.
And if I may add, it's also hard to know which organization, whoever's providing the information, is credible.
That's right. There are entire fake news sites out there. And I hate to say this, but I get on Facebook a lot. We do a lot of Facebook stuff with PolitiFact. I tweet a lot, something I thought I'd never do. But I get a lot of my information off Facebook. In the morning, I wake up, I go on there, I see whose birthday it is, and there must be 20 Facebook memes. Donald Trump said this, Hillary Clinton said this, and I'm looking at them as a fact checker going, is that wrong? Where did that come from? You know, who said that? What news agency is putting that out? Is that a partial truth that somebody's taken and made something else out of? So even I'm confused by it. But as that sort of disinformation continues to perpetuate, I think fact-checking will be even more important as we go forward.
Andra, I'm reminded, you're in the classroom with students who, you know, oftentimes Facebook, Twitter, social media is their first, the first source that they go to for news. Are you finding that it's harder for them and the broader public to sort of wade through what's accurate? And does it seem like it matters?
So they don't necessarily come into the classroom, I think, more or less informed than other people their age. And I think most people would come into my classes being relatively open about things. And so I tell them up front, I'm not trying to change your political views. Some people still don't believe me when I say that. But that I want to give them the tools so that they understand how to process information and to be able to discern. So, you know, there's especially a push because of our accreditation to make sure that we teach people evidence-based learning. And so my job is to help put things into context. So sometimes it's going back, and sometimes they don't understand, like, why I want you to understand the election of 1964. It's like, because there's a lot of stuff that happened in 1964 that actually looks somewhat similar to what we see today. So you can understand what you see today by having a sense of history. And so we'll focus a lot on history. industry. And then we'll also focus on ways to interpret information that's coming at you so that you can be an informed consumer of news and so that you can be an informed citizen when you go into the voting booth. And so I try to make it as dispassionate as possible and to try to take political bias out of it as much as I possibly can so that people can have the tools, because anybody who's well informed should be able to use the tools. And even if they come to a conclusion that I don't agree with, they have, as long as they've come to it in an informed way and that there's a logic behind it, then I think I've done my job. And so that's what I'm satisfied with. I kind of want to go back to this other question about why. Well, we've seen information proliferate. We've seen the role of the editor change over time, but we've also seen our trust as a country decline in the last generation and a half. So I think part of the reason why people want fact-checking a little bit more is because people are inherently a little more jaundiced than they were 50 years ago. We as a country have been through things where we've seen people who are in positions of authority and in trustworthy positions violate that trust. And I think because of that, there is an inherent need to have fact checkers in place so that people can identify spin and understand when they're being lied to. But I think there's also this issue with the proliferation of different types of news sources. It's very easy for you to find information that just confirms what you already thought. And if you already sort of, just looking for somebody to confirm your point of view, then you're not necessarily trying to figure out whether or not it's accurate. And so there, the job of the educator is to say, I know that this is comfortable for you, but you need to consider the other side of the story and to consider the ways that that might not be right. And I know it's uncomfortable for you, but that you'll actually be better for actually considering alternative points of view.
So I can see where that would happen in a classroom or a university setting, but is there room for that in the broader voting public for people to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to consider this, or this is, as you mentioned, this is comfortable for me, or you mentioned earlier, sort of the emotional, this is comfortable for me, for where I am emotionally. Then how do you answer that in terms of the broader political public?
So, I mean, that's where I see my role as a public scholar as being very important, because I can take, okay, I'll be at a couple of minutes of it usually, but I can take a soundbite from the classroom and bring it out to the wider public so that the wider public can be informed about it. But I also think that there are ways that, in even my own spheres of influence where my conversation can influence friends and family members. And I've also seen that my students do the same thing. So the tools that they learn in the classroom, they can take home with them. So, when they went home for fall break last week, maybe there was a dinner conversation where they may have challenged their parents or their siblings or their aunts and uncles to think about things differently. And so that's how, the process of education can kind of spread, even for people who don't have the opportunity to come to a place like Emory.
I mentioned earlier that over the course of several weeks, I've had an opportunity to, of course, watch the news and say, oh, that's interesting. I don't know if that's quite true. I'm wondering if there are examples that you all have where, for each of the presidential candidates, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, or if there were other, maybe more local races where you heard statements and you checked them out and you said, that's not true. And how did you sort of follow up with that? How did you come to that verdict that was inaccurate? What was the process like?
So I guess I'll go first. For Donald Trump, you've all heard him say, I was not for the Gulf War several times, almost every single time he speaks. Well, that's, we found, to be false. When he said that, we looked at transcriptions.
Documents.
Transcripts, thank you. Sorry about that. We looked at transcripts at what he said and found that he did speak on the Howard Stern show before our troops went into Iraq. But at that point, he said something along the lines of, yeah, I think it's, Bush is in a hard place. I think it's something we should do. But he was not saying anything that we shouldn't be against it. And then later on, we saw in 2014, he was on Neil Cavuto's show. And then that's when he came out, after our troops were already there, more than a year, he said he was against it. Can
can I interrupt you really quick? Because I want to know, and maybe this is just me, when you hear a statement, what's your first, where do you go to look? Do you do kind of like we do and go Google it? Or do you go back through old stories, or how do you even search it out?
Google is a very good tool.
There you go, okay.
But we also rely on our own reporting and other journalists' reporting, because that would have been a very big statement if someone of Donald Trump's caliber to say. And plus, at some point, I think he said he might have voted for it. Well, he didn't vote for anything. He's not an officer of the government. So that's where we start, and then we just start following the threads, if you will, and looking at what other journalists say, talking to our own experts, and craft the story from there. We don't, I mentioned earlier the verdicts that we come up with. We don't predetermine the verdict. It's where the facts take us.
And at PolitiFact, the first thing we do when we're checking a statement is we go back to the person or the entity that made it. If Hillary Clinton, we recently checked something by her. She said the U.S. is now energy independent, I think. So the first thing we would do on that is go back to the Hillary Clinton campaign, say we're checking this, is this accurate? Turns out she's not right on that. We produce a lot more oil than we do, and some years we're really good at it, but we're not energy independent. So we ruled that one false. But the first thing that we would do is go to her, then we would go to various institutions or think tanks or whatever that study energy independence and ask these guys. And sometimes you get varying opinions from these guys. So I wanted to make a point that fact-checking is not like the Word of God. It's not like Moses speaking down, to people. We have a process where a reporter or reporters look at something and they do their very best to ferret out the facts on it, but they're just badly dressed journalists in the end. That's what they are. And that then goes to a panel of 3 editors who are presented with these facts, and those editors vote about where that should rank on the truth-o-meter. The reporter usually recommends a ranking or a range of rankings, but those editors make the final determination, and that can be a 2-to-1 vote. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's 3-0, sometimes the editors can't agree, and you have to go back and do some more reporting on it. So again, we do everything we can to take partisanship out of this, and as she said, follow the facts. But in the end, it's a call. It's a subjective call by a group of people trying to do their best to get to the bottom of things.
So I think I'm going to give 2 examples that are kind of different. So it's not a question of true versus false, but I think it's a question of context. And I think it's the taking out of context that actually is really significant here. So for Hillary Clinton, I was at the press conference in August at the National Association of Black and Hispanic Journalists where Hillary Clinton gave that really complicated, convoluted answer about her emails. And we just sat in the audience going, this can't possibly be happening. Oh my gosh. Lady, just answer the question. And stopped, and she just went all around the mulberry bush, and it was just totally it didn't make any sense. And so it was the idea that she was trying to spin it and doing a horrible job of spinning it that just reinforced the frame that exists about her, that she's dishonest and not particularly transparent. So Hillary Clinton doesn't make the same types of outrageous statements that on their face kind of don't pass the smell test that will make you instantly go to Google or PolitiFact or reality check, but it's the spin that often gets her into trouble, and then you go back and think about it later. So it's a little bit different. For Donald Trump, I know that y'all gave him the award for Liar of the Year last year, but I think the thing that is probably more interesting about that is, after every debate when Donald Trump says that all the polls say that he won, it's not just that he's saying that and it's not true, it's the polls that he's looking at and the idea that he can't discern between a scientific poll versus an unscientific sort of pop-up survey or something that shows up in Twitter that I find actually really disturbing. And as a political scientist, that's my job to sort of explain, this is how you know a poll is good, and this is how you interpret a poll. So any pop-up things that shows up, so for instance in the AJC on the entertainment pages where it'll ask questions like the last one I saw is, are you gonna miss Brenda Wood at 11 Alive? So that's not a scientific survey. You can select in, so therefore it's not representative of everyone. And Brenda should feel great. I'm definitely gonna miss seeing her when I go to 11 Alive, but most people said, yeah, we're gonna miss her. So that's great. It's not scientific. Like if there had been sort of a random poll that, a polling company had done where they randomly got a list of voters and they called people and asked, then we could say that there's some scientific merit to that. But he's quoting Drudge. And so like Drudge is sending out tweets in the middle of the debate, and then you can kind of click on stuff. That there's nothing scientific about those polls at all. So there has to be some element of random sampling, or if you're doing opt-in internet survey sampling, some post-sample weighting that's being done to try to make sure that who you spoke to was actually reflective of the larger population. And so I don't know if that's mendacity on his part or a sheer lack of understanding about what the science of polling is about. But it's my job to point that out and say that's not how you interpret a poll. And so it's not quite a fact check thing. It's just more of a, you have no idea what you're talking about. And so let me explain how this works.
Yeah, Donald Trump is interesting for that angle because you have two very opposite candidates. Hillary Clinton, who parses everything. She's been a politician forever. She parses everything and weighs every word. Donald Trump just says whatever. He speaks in hyperbole a lot. Do you remember the piece? He said that, I think it was Ted Cruz's father was involved in the Kennedy assassination, and somebody goes, where'd you get that? He goes, well, I read it in the National Enquirer. So he's kind of the opposite of a fact checker, and he just talks off the top of his head, where Clinton and her campaign parse words generally very carefully. Now, sometimes she gets in extemporaneous situations like that where she doesn't. So it presents a real obstacle, I think, for fact checkers at our level when you're determining what are you going to actually fact check. I mean, did he really mean that? Is that just some wild, because we don't check opinion. Is that some wild opinion? Is that bar talk on his part? Or is that something he's really trying to make a point on? And he got in a real trouble with that on Fox when he said that, I think he said Obama and Hillary Clinton founded ISIS. And then the Fox commentator tried to walk him back on it. He says, you mean they created a vacuum by pulling troops out of Iraq that allowed for the founding of ISIS? He goes, oh, no, they founded ISIS. So that's a bit unusual for a political candidate to do that, and that's what we're faced with this year.
Well, I'd also like to add that there's also the low-hanging fruit, and they're very, very easy to check, such as when Hillary Trump says, when Donald Trump says, Hillary, you said the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was the gold standard. And she said, no, I didn't. Well, we just go back to the tape, and there it is. Or when Donald Trump says, I don't mean to pick on Donald Trump, but when he says that he never said that, go check out the sex tape for the former Miss Universe, Miss Machado. And he said, no, never said that. And it was right there on his Twitter page. So those things we point out because they matter.
And those things are the easy ones. We
Right,
had
low-hanging
difficulty
fruit.
checking one recently that came up in the debate where I think it was Trump said the murder rates going up across America in big cities. And we initially ruled that either false or mostly false. I can't remember the exact ruling now. And his people came back and said, well, the murder rate did go up in major cities last year. As a matter of fact, in New York City, it was up 45% or something. And that's a matter, there was that old Mark Twain saying, I think there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's where you choose your numbers. If you look at the trend line on violent crime in the cities in America over 10 or 20 years, it's gone down significantly. But if you only look at it if Donald Trump had said the murder rate's up significantly over the last year, he's right about that. And we actually ruled on a statement where he said that and gave him a true or mostly true, I can't remember. So you can cherry pick numbers to kind of make them mean whatever you want to. And we run into that constantly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Nancy, I want to go back. You mentioned checking things on video, and I want to know if it's on video, is that pretty much the way that you could say, well, it's been said or it's true? Is that a means to fact check? If it's on video or audio tape, we have to throw that in as well. So if you see it.
It is a means, but it also depends on the context with which it was said, because the question might have been a little bit different, or they might have answered it a little bit differently. We try to expand upon what they're actually saying, not just a short snippet. So it is a means. Okay. And we also go back to look at what they might have said previously, too. So sometimes they misspeak. If they have misspoken, then we usually don't fact check it.
So there is some wiggle room in the fact-checking process. I want to go back because during our last exchange, you all mentioned some different sources and there are different polls that may be on Twitter or in different forms of media. And I want to know, for those of us who are out here who are reading and picking things up, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter, how do we know sort of what is a reliable source in terms of checking the facts? I mean, we know Reality Check, we know PolitiFact, but maybe there is something that's in print or it's online, it looks legitimate. How can we sort of vet whether or not it is a legitimate source? For those who maybe haven't heard of Drudge.
Well, Drudge is not a source I would say is a credible source, or the Daily Mail. I would say that to do your homework properly, you should go to a variety of sources, whether it's CNN Reality Check or PolitiFact or FactCheck.org or the AJC for that matter. It could be any number of legitimate sources that pull together and are attributing where they got their information from.
I would agree with that, and that's our kind of principle, is to go to multiple sources. If you call up one of our fact checks on our digital pages, if you go over to the right-hand side, it lists, we're totally transparent, or we try to be, and it has hyperlinks to all the sources you can go to. Sometimes we refer to an email or whatever, but I think what you said is correct. You need to go to as many sources as you can, because that's what we do. When I wake up in the morning, I look at Drudge, I look at Huffington Post, I look at the New York Times, I look at the Washington Post, I look at the AJC, I look at PolitiFact, and also I get a thing of kind of obscure sites if you're not into politics, like Real Clear Politics, The Hill, and things like that. Real Clear Politics, you were talking about polling earlier. They run an aggregation of poll and polling averages. So if you really want to know what polling is really showing, you might want to go to a site like that, because it'll show what the averages are throughout the country. That tends to remove any partisanship or whatever in those polls. But yeah, check out as many sources as you can, because we try to be a good source, but we're certainly not the ultimate source on everything either. So look at us, there's lots of stuff out there at your fingertips, and you need to look at a lot of it.
And I would say that if you're getting something from a source that you're not familiar with, then go to the About page or read something else that will tell you about that source, just so that you know exactly where it's coming from. And I think, allow yourself to, make mistakes. So I got a link from a friend one morning, and it said Creflo Dollar had endorsed Donald Trump. And so it seemed plausible, because there is this theory in evangelical circles that prosperity gospel folks are attracted to Trump, and people were friends with him already. So it seemed quite believable. I was like, that's interesting. So let me just Google this on my own, and then found out that it was from a hoax site. So, and that Dollar had to issue a press release that was like, no, I didn't do this. And so it was just, it was interesting. And the person who sent this to me is actually incredibly well informed. It just seemed funny, and it fit a certain frame of mindset. And so he sent it on to me. And I've also had folks who were who work as journalists. So somebody sent me a text the day Muhammad Ali died, saying that he died probably about 12 hours before he actually did, because the reports were already starting to come out. And I was like, and I was like, should I send out a tweet? And something was like, nah, I should wait. And then I went, and I think I clicked on the CNN where it said he's in critical condition, or it said something like, the end is near, but that he was still alive. And so it's just a question of, I think part of the problem in our society today is that we want to do things quick. And, there's this need to not get scooped, and it's not just journalists who are subjected to that. You want to be the first in your circle to post something. And so sometimes it's just helpful to kind of just sit back and go, let me make sure I verify this before I put this out there. And so just, understand that everybody makes mistakes. And so that, it's okay to wait 5 minutes or not necessarily be the first person to post something.
You really bring up a good point, because I was going to ask in terms of the role of social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or even just a text message, in spreading factual information and misinformation that sounds plausible. And lots of times, I've done this, you think that the source that you get it from is reliable, so you just, that's interesting, and there it goes. And then you've got to, it's gone and gone to a whole lot of people. So talk a little bit about that role for the rest of us in terms of what we get and how, how it's disseminated.
My husband will attest to this. I'm on social media, but I'm not on social media. I'm a voyeur. So I do see all of the stories that go by and misinformation and true stories. I tend to read them, but again, I just check multiple stories by different outlets.
The misinformation, sort of bring your day job into the social media realm and say, oh, that's not true? Or do you just kind of, I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
It does, if it's blatant, especially. But if it's just another, if it's a story that we did, especially, it plays a role in my day job. But if it's a story that the Washington Post does that has information that we don't have, then we send our reporters and producers to work to try and verify the claims. Washington Post is an extremely credible source of information and a wonderful news outlet. But they, like CNN, can be wrong sometimes.
If I see something on I have a personal Facebook page and we have a PolitiFact Facebook page, and if I tend to see somebody rambling on there about something that we've done a fact check on recently that I recall and can find the link to very quickly, I'll post it, say, oh, we've looked at this. I don't try to say you're an idiot, this is wrong, but I say, hey, we looked at something on this. So I do tend to do that, and I don't know if that's good or bad, because I don't know how many of you are on Facebook, but the political discussions on there don't really change anybody's mind. They're just people wanting to be heard. So, but I tend to do that. If again, we have done the fact check recently, I'm familiar with it and it's pertinent to what these folks are saying. Twitter baffles me. Like I said, I tweet, but I have, I think PolitiFact Georgia has maybe 8,000 Twitter followers, not a lot. But by the time I'll tweet and I'll get ready to do another tweet, like 3 seconds later, there's already 30 tweets ahead of mine. And when I look at Twitter, I'm actually, as an old guy, baffled by it. I'll scroll down for 20 or 30 things and I'm just tired of it, and it's moving faster than I can keep up with. A friend of mine refers to Twitter as the nuclear war of the internet, and people. We have social media experts with PolitiFact, and they tell us things like, for every PolitiFact you do, tweet it 20 times. And I'm thinking, if everybody out there is tweeting everything they do 20 times, then it's just this constant roll of stuff. So, like I said, I don't get Twitter, and I tend not to get involved in anything other than tweeting our fact checks that we've done. I don't try to respond to anybody on that.
I want to just mention, we will open up for Q&A from our audience. So be getting your questions ready for our panelists, okay? So I wanted to ask you, in the context of what you do in terms of fact-checking and things like that, you have a mechanism for saying, oh, that's not very true, or maybe that's out of context, or pants on fire, or that's true. And I'm wondering, though, for the broader media or for broader journalists out there, is it ever appropriate for journalists to say to a candidate that, that wasn't true, or is there a mechanism for them, or should they quote Reality Check or PolitiFact, as we saw in the video, where they say, well, PolitiFact found that wasn't accurate. What's the mechanism for that?
You mean for on air, or
for whether it's on air or whether it's in print or social media?
Yeah, we've done that in news stories occasionally, where we'll say somebody said something, but PolitiFact found. We won't necessarily say it's not true. We'll say PolitiFact ruled this on that. And while like the political debates are going on, we're doing live fact checking, which are going out through tweets and social media. And NPR has done a really great job. They've sort of surpassed everybody, I think, recently with what they're doing on live fact checking. You got to remember too, in politics, that's not quite as hard as it sounds, because a lot of these people speak in sound bites that have been perfected over many months, and they're repeating those sound bites over and over and over again. So a lot of that stuff we've checked, and we have fact checks on it, so we can pop it up pretty quickly. If Donald Trump says, I was never for the war in Iraq, we can immediately go and find something on that. If Hillary Clinton says, oh, I've always been against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we know exactly what her position is on there. We could pull up 5 fact checks and throw them up. So it's the longer campaigns go on, the less difficult that is. Do you guys do live stuff the night of the debate? Is that?
We don't do it live, but we do what's called quick takes. We didn't do it during the Democratic and Republican debates, but started during the presidential debates, where they are exactly what you said. They're claims that have been made before, and we have them at our fingertips. We've probably done upwards of 400 to 500 reality checks. And so we go right to them. We know that we've done them. We update any information because a lot of times they include figures that might have changed over the months. And we top it with the new claim. And then we put that out. So quick takes, probably within 15 minutes after it's said. But usually with the regular reality checks, we want to take our time because the worst thing we can do is be wrong. We don't want to be called out. And so some of the times we just hold on until we have agreed upon what we think is the right verdict and make sure that it's backed up with all of the sources.
I think that that's something that, and we can maybe draw some comfort about, that it's not always about the speed, but the fact that, you know, you all are taking, and it's been mentioned several times, taking the time to fact check, and verify that this stuff is accurate. And I think for those of you in the room who are wanting to find reliable sources, the work is being put in for that. So.
Yeah. I mean, if there were one thing that I would add to it, I mean, I think what's interesting about this is, and I thought about sort of when I would write my own book and I would be confronted with information that I thought wasn't necessarily the most accurate, I didn't think strategically that it made sense for me to start calling people out as liars. But I could say, they say this, and then these other people say this. Or here is what's logically missing from this statement. And then I just let the reader kind of figure it out on their own and sort of draw their own conclusions. And I think in most conventional election cycles, that's probably okay. I think what we've witnessed in the last month in particular is journalists being fed up, and then also journalists being worried that they might have been complicit in making this election cycle a circus by giving candidates so much free airtime. And so I think they're now trying to correct it. And I think one of the things that we'll have to go back and reflect upon is that the sort of hard fact-checking really started after the second week or so in September, so after the birther press conference. And people were just mad about the fact that they got duped into airing sort of what they perceived to be an infomercial. And so that anger then led to kind of people being a little bit more vigilant about saying that people were, you know, liars and other kinds of things. And so I think the question, the reflection that will likely happen after the fact was, to what extent did anger kind of motivate that decision, and whether or not that helped to elevate the discourse or not.
Yeah. It's interesting to me in this election cycle that it's more covered than any election cycle has ever been. Yet I think the average voter has less information about where the candidates really stand on major issues. I mean, that's not what the last debate was about. And that's kind of depressing to me. I don't know the solution to that, but again, you've got more people out there covering it than ever, and you've got less real information about the real issues. Now, maybe that's the way the debates are set up. They're not really debates, in my opinion, but maybe something needs to be done about that. But it's really hard to figure out where these guys are on reducing the, really serious stuff like ratio of federal debt to GDP, things that will really impact my children and grandchildren. I don't really know where they are on that, and I look at this stuff every day. So again, better covered and less real information coming out sometimes. And I think, again, fact checkers help with that, but we're certainly not the solution.
Very good point. Are there any questions from the audience? We'll get a mic. And then I saw your hand first, so let's wait till we get a microphone and.
While we're waiting, can I just add, earlier today, speaking about Google, they have now begun their own putting a fact check tool in their search engine.
Wow.
For what they consider to be reliable and most cited fact checks. That might be something else you might be interested in.
Interesting.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I have a question about, someone referred to how there are all these fake news sites, and sort of along those same lines, how do citizens reporters change the game? There was the guy who I hadn't heard of as working for a major news source who sort of uncovered that Melania-Michelle overlap of the speeches at the Republican convention. And I'm wondering if major politicians are having their own fact checkers to kind of call out the other side?
Good question.
Well, there have always been internal fact checkers who do opposition research. And so they're usually looking for dirt on candidates to try to, smear their candidates. And one of the things that's actually really interesting, before I took my job here, I worked for a pollster. And, we looked at opposition research. And one of the things that people tended to be very clear about was that if we were going to test stuff for messaging in polls, we sure as heck had to have something to back up what we were going to do, because that was going to inform the ads where you would see the little small citations in the bottom of the ads. So, it would be unethical as a pollster for you to do push polling, where you just throw out stuff and who cares whether or not it's true. So there always has been this emphasis on making sure that if you're going to throw something out there, that you've got enough evidence to actually be able to say that it's true. And I think sort of the beauty of the Melania Michelle type of situation, which was really interesting, and I found out about it in a car, in Cleveland, sort of going home from the convention the first night, was that it refers back to primary evidence. So there were transcripts, so all you have to do is look at the transcripts, and so the transcripts can speak for themselves. So there, it doesn't matter whether or not it's a professional journalist doing it, or so long as you can verify that those transcripts were in fact real, that's I would call that the gold standard.
Could you talk a little bit about how you see that, developing in the future or changing the landscape of news reporting, if you have any comments?
Well, I'll defer to the journalists on that, but in many instances, especially in African American politics, people talk about biases and blind spots that the journalism corps may have, and citizen journalists actually help to bring certain things to the forefront. So, for instance, we did a forum with Eric Garner's daughter, about 1.5 years ago, and one of the things she talked about was that she could tweet out stuff that was happening that the local news in New York or the national news wasn't going to cover. And so there are ways that people do use sort of citizen journalism to be able to tell stories that they don't think are actually getting adequate attention.
Yeah, and from a newspaper standpoint, you've got to remember the newspaper landscape is shrinking. We used to have a staff of almost 600 people. We're down to probably 150 or so now. And that's true across the country. It's true at the New York Times, Washington, everybody. I mean, they're going down. So I think citizen journalists, for better or worse, will fill in the gaps that traditional journalists are being pulled away from.
Good point. Another question?
Thank you. I'm also an Emory alum of the law school. Appreciate this program. I'm here to complain about my political facts check score. I don't have an appeal, so I'm just going to complain. I was right. Y'all weren't, but my question is, last week, Jeff Greenfield and Leonard Pitts were in town, and they said that about 6 million people watch Fox, CNN, and MSNBC combined, and 135 million people vote. And the problem is not the strength of or the weakness of political dialogue, it's the fact that people don't care and they don't believe anything they're heard. Would you tell me if that's right?
I think you're right. I mean, I think if you look at the outsider candidates this year, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, the Republicans they're both outsiders, and they're kind of vehicles for people's anger, I think, on the left and right. And the Republicans tried every way they could to stop Donald Trump, and they failed. The Democrats tried to stop Bernie Sanders, and they did. But yeah, I think a lot of people, you keep hearing this term thrown around, the system's rigged. I'm not sure if that's a good word to use, but a lot of people feel they have no control over the system, that there are things going on in these orbits that they're not really part of. And you may know the answer to this, but it's less than half the people vote, is that right, that are eligible to vote? It's some shocking number of people, despite all the breathless rhetoric we hear in these debates and everything. Most people just don't go out and participate.
The primary turnout's about 25% or so.
And in general election turnout on a presidential election year, it'll be between 50 and 60% of voting age population.
Right? That's when
60% is a high water.
So,
yeah.
So that's very sad, and I think you're right. I think people are increasingly cynical. I don't know if it's the things we've talked about here, where you've got all these sources of information coming at them and they don't really believe anything, where they don't believe they really have any control over this big amorphous process that money plays a huge role in. But there's something going on out there this year, and I've been in this business for 40 years. I've covered politics a lot of it. This is a very different year. I read an essay the other day. I don't know if it was in the Atlantic. I pulled it off Real Clear Politics, one of my favorite sites. But it was called The Angry American, and it kind of went into this fact that people are very angry. They're supporting non-traditional candidates who are kind of out there, and they just seem to have gripes that they don't feel anybody's addressing, and they don't feel the political process is a mechanism for them to address those grievances.
And unfortunately, for those of us in the media, they also don't trust the media. The media.
Yeah, the media, if you.
They don't trust the police. They don't trust the media.
That's
they don't
right.
trust the churches.
All the institutions. You look at the media rankings. I can't remember if we're just above or below Congress, but it's pretty low. So people, and that's something we get so involved, and our jobs are pretty hard sometimes, and they require long hours. We don't really think about that, but we're part of the process, and people don't like us as a whole. They may like me as Jim Tharpe, but they don't like the media. And that's, again, another institution that's gone by the wayside, I think.
Can I ask you, what can we do in the media to make you believe or trust what we say?
Well, I know many of the folks that obviously cover Georgia politics, and I trust most of them. I'm leery of TV people, but most of the print folks I trust. You talked about Hillary Clinton parsing words. What she is she's sometimes too nerdy and too boring and too lawyer-like, and I kind of identify with that. I'll spend for 45 minutes on the phone with one of your reporters who doesn't quote me because I'm not dramatic, I'm nerdy, I'm lawyerly, I'm boring. But I taught him something in 45 minutes that she maybe or maybe not wasn't interested in hearing.
So it seems like y'all are pretty limited in like what you fact check, because there are things that you can fact check and the things that you say are opinion and sort of concept. I find that when trying to sort of change people's minds about things, like it's sort of, you have to go after those opinions more than the facts than anything in order to really shift things. So I guess my question is to sort of clarify, I come from like a social constructivist, like epistemology concept of like, how do we know what we know? And how do we know what's true and what's false? And like, how do we like decide like, oh, this is like 20% likely or that's 80% likely to be true? And sort of how do we go through those concepts? And do you see, I guess to my question, do you see a way that you can sort of like up your game a little bit and sort of start like looking into like deeper currents rather than, well, they said this or they didn't say that, in order to sort of like maybe shift dialogue?
Yeah, that's one of the things we're criticized for, and I think legitimately, if I understand what you're saying, is we kind of look at the trees sometimes and don't see the forest. And I think that's a legitimate criticism of PolitiFact. We take words very seriously. We take very specific statements very seriously. But I think that's a criticism a lot of people have of fact checkers, and I think they may have a point on that. I don't think fact checkers are ever going to be able to fact check opinion. I mean, it's what somebody thinks. I mean, they may think it wrongly, but they think that. Or they're not going to be able to fact check predictions. We get a lot of people, I'm not sure if somebody said that, the Iranian nuclear deal is going to be a disaster and it's going to end up being a major war in the Middle East. Well, they say, you need to fact check that. Well, you can't you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You can say that we got the best deal we could without going to war or whatever. You can fact check something like that. So to your point, I think we sometimes we're too precise and we don't look at the big picture enough. I think you're right about that.
And I think that that's actually also the role of the analyst. To help put things into context or to talk about plausibility or to talk about whether or not other people have considered this before or whether or not this has been tried in the past so that you can get a sense. So I don't think anybody can take uncertainty completely out of the game. And so people are going to have to make a decision based on the knowledge that they have about who they think presents the best plan going forward. But in addition to fact checking, there are a lot of surrogates, particularly on television, who are shilling for their candidates and just repeating the same old talking points, and they're not actually always saying things that are constructive. And some of them say things that are just kind of outright outrageous sometimes. And so if there were more space for analysts to actually sit and parse okay, here's what this means, here are the potential implications for this, here's how this fits into other patterns that we've been able to observe in the past, that might give you more information, but even still, I can't tell you whether or not the Iran nuclear deal is gonna be good or bad. I can give an educated best guess, and I shouldn't be the ones doing it. My colleagues in IR should be the ones who are doing that, to tell you sort of what I think that is. And I think it's either true or false, or people giving their opinions and stumping for their candidates on air or in op-eds and not necessarily advancing the dialogue at all.
I also wanted to add, first you said that we're trying to change people's opinions. I don't think that's any of our goals. We're trying to inform you on what's been said, what's out there. Statistics, which we go to the Census Bureau, we go to FBI data, we go to the Bureau of Economic, I forgot what it's called, but the Economic Policy Institute, they keep track, and use those figures and that data to help explain, well, this is where we are, and using all of that information, this is what's accepted within that industry. And just trying to put it into context, we're not trying to change anybody's mind.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm sorry, there are more questions than we have time for.
I'd like to ask a question on how you deal with something like WikiLeaks, and what are we to believe as far as the content that we receive through different media sources, and then the talk about what is real or isn't, and where are these hacks and this information coming from? How can you PolitiFact some of that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's something else that's come in from left field, is stolen information, essentially, that's being put out there. And how do you know that people aren't, that 9/10 of it is not true and they slipped a 10th of it in there just to make a point? Well, you first of all have to go back to the people they're saying this about and ask them about it. I mean, that's the obvious thing you do. And try to triangulate it if you can. But that's a very good question. I mean, some of the stuff you don't know. And I think the latest week, I can't keep up with them all. So many come out every day. There were more this afternoon, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think, was it Sidney Blumenthal, one of the Democrats, they'd gone to him and asked him about it. He goes, I don't know, who knows how much of that stuff's true or something. So that presents, that's a really excellent point, especially if there's stuff in that leaked material that's very damning. I mean, I guess you have to pinpoint what you're going after and go to as many sources as you can on it outside of WikiLeaks to try to figure it out. But I'm not sure you ever get to the bottom of some of that.
So we have about 3 weeks left. I would like to ask each of our panelists, what's one takeaway that you would like for us to leave here this evening with as we go into the home stretch, if you will? Andra?
I think interpretation is more important than anything else. So there's a lot of information that's being presented. If it seems illogical, if the way that it's gathered and being interpreted seems false, and you have a base of knowledge by which you can say that they're misinterpreting a poll, or the way they're talking about economic policy goes against certain types of theories, go with that. And I would also say triangulate. So get things from as many sources as possible. So it's getting multiple sources before you actually take something at face value.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that's what we do in our lives to try to come to some sort of conclusion. So look at as many sources as you can and try to look at legitimate sources. Don't get your information from Facebook and Twitter.
I hear an echo. Research, research, research.
All right. Well, we will end it there. I hope that you're informed as we go into the home stretch. Thank you so much to our panelists.